She thought it was another drunk staggered by the fountain, a body to tidy out of the cold and forget by morning. Then she saw the blood on his sleeve, thin and dark against the wool, and the way his hand curled as if clinging to something he could not name. That night in Guanajuato, beneath strings of colored lights and behind the bright noise of a plaza still celebrating Noche Buena, Esperanza Mendoza's life changed because she carried one stranger across a city's cobblestones and into the room where she kept hope alive. The streets smelled like roasted corn and firewood, sweet smoke from tamales cooling in their banana leaves, and the faint metallic tang of winter. Lamps threw soft pools across the stone. Paper lanterns fluttered at doorways where families lingered before midnight. Esperanza moved between those pools with practiced economy, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, two small bundles of cloth swinging from her arm, one a bundle of lace she had mended, the other a tin of thread and thimbles for Doña Carmen. Lupita, awake on the other side of the house, would be waiting with bright questions and half-formed prayers. The seamstress's hands were always busy, her life measured in stitches and small acts of repair. She didn't mean to be on the plaza where the stranger lay. She had meant only to take a shortcut past the fountain, to finish a last delivery and get back to the stove where tamales steamed and rose. But the plaza is one of those places that keeps its own watch after dark, and that night it held a man under its merciless sky. He had been thrown against the fountain stone with more force than Providence allows the common drunk. Blood darkened the edge of his collar. His breath came shallow, as if the cold were stealing it. When Esperanza crouched close enough to smell the alcohol and the iron, she felt the kind of slow, honest fear that settles in the throat. Many in the barrio could live with hunger or cold. None of them could pretend their neighbor's life was someone else's problem. "Stay," she told him, though she did not know if he could hear her. Her voice was small. It was not the voice of someone dramatic. It was the voice of a woman who had had to whisper to an anxious daughter at 2 a.m, who had needed to calm an ailing mother with promises she could keep. It was a voice built of many ordinary mercies. She hauled him up as gently as her strength would allow. His weight surprised her, solid, not the limp weight of a drunk. When she drew the shawl from her shoulders and wrapped it around his shoulders, she noticed the cut at his temple. There was sand in a cuff, an odd sliver of silk caught where a hand might have brushed a pocket. He smelled faintly of citrus and of some cleaner that was not part of the barrio. His skin where it showed was cooler than hers, less sunned, an odd thing to find beneath the red clay and sunburned hands of Guanajuato's sons and daughters. At home, Doña Carmen had dozed with her rosary across her chest. The grandmother woke at the disturbance of the door and the scrape of someone new on their threshold. She was 70, and had the wisdom of all the Sundays she'd spent under the Virgen's mantle. Her hands knew where to press for fever, where to tuck a blanket, and where to offer a prayer. She rose, shuffled to the narrow bed where her daughter and grandson-in-law slept at times, and where their visitors sometimes slept more often than strangers would expect. Lupita, with cheeks like small apples, opened one eye and then another. "Mama?" she whispered, rubbing sleep from her lashes. When the stranger's face came into the lamplight, she stilled, studying him with a child's quick compassion. Children are dangerous in their judgments because they offer help without the complicated cost calculations adults make. Lupita reached forward, small fingers checking that the stranger breathed. They set him on the narrow cot that held many borrowed afternoons of rest. Esperanza cut away the worst of the blood with slow, sure motions that come from years of altering hems, sewing on buttons with near-invisible stitches. When she found the silk handkerchief folded inside a pocket, delicately edged in linen thread and monogrammed with initials, an elegant script like a whisper from another life, she felt a tiny, illogical ache, as if she'd found a coin from a place she'd never been. The letters were familiar only in the way of unexpected things.
They suggested other rooms, other names, a life that did not belong between their thin walls. He slept through the night, or into a shadow that measured neither hours nor promises. The house hummed with small sounds, the clock's slow tick, the whisper of rain beginning to thread the eaves, Lupita's breath. Esperanza sat by him with a cupped mug of hot atole in one hand and a needle in the other, because hands need work when hearts are too full. Her fingers moved through fabric while she watched his chest rise and fall. She found herself murmuring soft things to the Virgen de Guadalupe, as if the mother of the poor could gather strangers and fold them into her mantle. They named him Alejandro before he opened his eyes. No one offered that name as a fact. It was a word that seemed to belong to him, soft and dignified, one that felt right slipping off the tongue. It felt wrong to call him merely the man, and wrong to leave him to the street. Names bind a life, and that night Esperanza intended to hold to whatever fragile life would be kept in her small house. When he finally woke, he had the look of someone trying to remember a map whose streets had been erased. His eyes came to focus slowly, like light finding its way through frosted glass.
He blinked, confused, and then he looked at them with a steady, polite wariness that suggested training or good breeding. There was something in the tilt of his chin and the way he tried to speak that did not fit the barrio's cadence. "What happened?" he asked in careful Spanish, words clipped as if the exact pronunciation mattered more than the meaning. "You were at the fountain," Esperanza answered. "You were hurt. We brought you home." He touched his temple with a long, careful hand and frowned. His fingers were clean in a way that suggested someone else had tended them with quiet tools. No callus, no ink. "I remember a car, then the light." He paused, as if listening for a piece of a song that had been cut. "I don't know my name." Amnesia has a theatrical sound in stories, but in life it's mostly soft and ordinary. Confusion, holes, the humiliation of asking the same question twice. He guessed at his own name. When he tried on Alejandro, it fit like a glove he'd never worn but somehow needed. He laughed at himself for the uncertainty, a small, brittle sound. Doña Carmen, with the quickness of a woman who has seen sorrow and keepers of the neighborhood, made soup and pressed cool cloths to his forehead. Lupita fetched a rosary and laid it on his chest, as if perhaps prayer could lend him a scaffold until memory returned. Esperanza watched this and felt an odd mixture of protectiveness and practicality. There were rules in the barrio, a code of how you care for a stranger. Feed him, warm him, ask the doctor if necessary. But this man carried about him an air that suggested questions that would not be solved by broth alone. Over the next days, small clues leaked from his lost life. He had a way of resting his hands that betrayed familiarity with elegant furniture. When he reached for a cup, he did so with deliberation, as if he had been taught to use his hands with something like ceremony. In the pocket of a coat they'd hung to dry, Esperanza found a card heavier than the paper of her bills, a hotel key embossed with a name she half recognized from passing advertisements in the city's magazines. There were cufflinks wrapped in tissue, a receipt from a dry cleaner in a language that flirted with English, the faint scent of leather and foreign soaps. Alejandro learned to roll tamales with Lupita on a small square of butcher paper. The first time he pressed masa into a leaf, he did so with astonishing tenderness, slow and methodical, as if he were handling an heirloom. Lupita chattered happily and corrected him with the candor of a child. "No, like this, Papa, like this." He laughed, sometimes from a place of genuine joy that surprised him. In the kitchen, Doña Carmen taught him when to add salt, when to press the dough to test if it was ready. There was a common prayer they said before eating, a quick whispered, "Gracias, Diosito," and he bowed his head with reverence that did not ask to be understood. At night, the barrio's sounds softened. The posada came and went with trombones and laughter. Neighbors knocking on doors, expecting songs in exchange for bread and a warm place within someone else's room. One evening, the little procession stopped at Esperanza's house. People clustered, singing, faces illuminated by candlelight, and they asked for hospitality in the old way. Esperanza stood at her doorway, elbow resting on the jamb, knitting the warmth of their voices into the corner of her life. Alejandro watched from the kitchen window, framed in the doorway like a man out of an old photograph. His face caught the candles in a way that made his features both younger and older at once. There was a softness in his eyes that surprised even Esperanza. For all the tenderness, there were cautions. Esperanza moved around him with a watchfulness that was partly maternal and partly pragmatic. She had a baby to raise and a mother who needed steady medicine and attention. A stranger's chest could not take the place of wages. If he were dangerous, and there were reasons to suspect many things in a city that held its secrets, she would protect Lupita and Doña Carmen first. She set rules for him. No wandering alone into the night. Ask before you touch. If you feel sick, tell us. He agreed, grateful and disoriented, as if grateful for a kindness that redeemed him from a smaller fall. On a slow morning, 3 days after she found him, Esperanza turned on the small television she kept in the kitchen for news bulletins. It was for the radios mostly, but sometimes the tiny screen showed images that made the world beyond their hill seem close enough to reach. The screen flickered between a telenovela and a morning show, then cut to a live report, a stretch of highway with cars lined like beads after an accident. The reporter's voice was precise and brisk. The anchor's smile never reached his eyes. A still image of the man in a pressed suit filled the screen. He was standing in front of a hotel lobby with a crowd behind him. Even in the small, grainy image, there was a posture of command. His hands rested on a table like someone used to owning a decision. A name scrolled beneath. Esperanza's needle paused in her hand. The room seemed to warm and thin, as if air were being pulled from one corner and sent through some long tube to the other side of the world. Alejandro Castillo Ibarra, the anchor read, missing since the crash late Sunday night, president of Grupo Hospitalidad Castillo. The name struck Esperanza like a stone. She had handled silk handkerchiefs and monogrammed initials all her life, but names like that were the kind that lived in different houses, big glass ones, hotels with bellhops and polished lobbies, rooms with drapes that never had smoke stains. The world she knew and the world on the screen rarely touched. Doña Carmen's hand flew to her mouth. Lupita's eyes went large and wet. Esperanza felt the room shrink and widen all at once. Memories and possibilities tumbled together. The man on their cot, who had learned to make tamales with a child's sincerity, was the same face now mapped across city news, tagged with a fortune and a family name that carried weight. Questions began to crowd her mind with the impertinence of urgency. How could this be? Had he been the victim of a crime? A wealthy man such as he could be well protected. Why here? Why broken by an ordinary plaza? And if this man was indeed the head of a corporate castle built on polished stone, what did that mean for them? Would reporters arrive with microphones and hard questions? Would lawyers demand to see him? Would he, waking to riches and memory, decide that this small house was nothing more than a temporary fault line in his life, an inconvenience to be corrected? The television continued. Footage showed the highway again, an overturned car, a crowd, a flashing siren. The anchor's voice moved into the cold business of speculating, family statements, possible causes, the expected whirlwind of grief and corporate crisis.
Someone called it an accident. Another anchor called it troubling. The internet, when they could pull in a signal, would be a beast that ate men and left bones. Alejandro watched the screen as if seeing his own life through glass. He did not look at them with surprise, so much as with a gentle, dawning fear. "Is that me?" he asked, voice small. He had said so many names in recent days, and each one fit differently, like a garment tried on in a dim closet. This name, this face in lights, draped him in a universe he had not yet learned the rules of. Esperanza felt the anchor of her will shift on its moorings. Practical instincts rose: call the police, alert someone, do the right thing. But a different, slower current pulled her. She had seen what being invisible to power did to a person. She had seen dozens of people fall through the cracks of an indifferent system, and she had patched what she could with thread and soup and prayer. A man who woke up in her house, who could not remember his name, who had learned the taste of tamales and the sound of Lupita's laughter, could she hand him over to a world that would likely not notice the small mercies that had stitched him back together? Doña Carmen's grip tightened on the rosary. "We must call," she said sternly, voice threaded with care and fear. Her hands are not quick to jump to panic, but she had been the one to nurse the family through fevers and public humiliations. She knew the consequences of a head held against an indifferent bureaucracy. "Wait," Esperanza said, the single syllable a dam against a torrent. She thought of how the neighborhood had held her when Lupita's father had left, when bills had failed to be paid, when the sewing machine had broken. The world outside might have been different for men who wore cufflinks. The world inside their walls had its own rules of salvation: soft blankets, hot broth, a rosary, and the sharp practicality of neighbors who arrived with bread.
"We call the doctor first. Let them examine him. If he is hurt or needs medicine, we will do right by him." Doña Carmen's eyes searched her daughter's face, reading long experience and the tiredness that comes from being the family's steady heart. "You are thinking about Lupita," the grandmother said. It was not a rebuke, but an acknowledgement. Esperanza nodded. She was thinking not just about her daughter, but about the small economies that kept them alive. A man with a name like that, with a moneyed past, could appear and make promises that sounded like salvation until a fine print undid the life they'd built. Alejandro, for his part, seemed stranded between gratitude and embarrassment. He ran a hand over his mouth as if tasting the memory of other mouths, talk of meetings, of a man in a suit offering a hard handshake. "I remember faces," he said slowly. "I remember a room full of people making decisions. I remember someone who might have been my uncle, but it's like fog. I feel things, commands, obligations, but they are outside me." Outside was a dangerous place for fog. Corporate storms arrive in suits and lawyers, but also in newspapers that print names like verdicts. Esperanza understood that secrecy had a price. She also understood that the kindness of a barrio was not something to be weighed purely in a ledger. The day pressed forward, and life moved in the strange new pattern of people protecting something fragile. When a neighbor walked by and glanced in, expecting perhaps a drunk or a vagrant, and saw the face he'd already seen on a screen, there were small murmurs of speculation. A boy with a camera phone lingered too long on the wall, a caption ready on his tongue. Rumor travels like a sieve that lets through truths and holds the rest. That afternoon, without fully understanding why she chose to do it, Esperanza placed the silk handkerchief back into the stranger's pocket. It felt like folding a flag over something contested. The initials, once a token of another life, became a token between them, an unspoken agreement that would have to be negotiated with more than words. For Alejandro, the barrio was a slow kind of revelation. He learned quickly which streets were best for shortcuts, which neighbors would give a little extra sugar when they were making coffee, which children dared to knock on the door and ask for a story.
He began to notice the little things he'd never had to notice before. How dawn light looks on painted windowsills, how the sound of a sewing machine can be a kind of anthem for endurance. Yet memory remained a fickle guest.
Sometimes a laugh would tug thread. His mouth would curve in recognition at an offhand phrase, and a boardroom tableau would flicker through. A flash of a smile from a woman whose photograph would later cause trouble, a name he could not place. At other times, a smell would knock him back into silence. The scent of leather and wax would pull the memory of a hotel lobby through his ribs. The scream of sirens would make him flinch awake, as if the past had slipped its leash. As days blurred, the neighborhood's kindness came in small quotidian installments. A man from down the street fixed an old chair for him without asking payment. A neighbor, whose daughter worked nights as a cleaner in one of the hotels, slipped him a newspaper with the business section folded inside. The paper contained a dry, small column about uncertain succession at Grupo Hospitalidad Castillo, neatly tucked between advertisements for luxury vacations and a piece on holiday spending. The piece sketched names and hinted at power plays. Alejandro ran his finger along the thin columns as if trying to read a biography written in small print. He kept asking one question that had no immediate answer. What did one do when their old life was now a frame around a new one? There is a difference between remembering and being able to step back into a life you once owned. Memory alone doesn't reteach the heart how to love, or the hands how to sew. Riches do not guarantee virtue. Sometimes they simply ensure that mistakes are more comfortable. Word of the missing man spread beyond the barrio's edges. A reporter called the hotel. The hotel issued a terse statement. A small, organized cluster of people began to orbit their house, curious neighbors, a nosy cousin, perhaps, a man who had been a driver and now had questions. The city had a way of pulling at loose ends, and loose ends often belonged to those who walked between worlds. On the morning a thin drizzle smeared the streets into small mirrors, a woman in a sharp coat arrived with a business card and a hard, efficient smile. She introduced herself as Patricia. She said she worked for Alejandro's office and that she had come to help, or to assure his safe return, depending on how one read the stiffness of her jaw. She walked into the small kitchen with the proprietorial air of someone accustomed to making decisions for men who did not ask permission. "You cannot keep him here," she said in a voice that folded back on itself to sound kindly. "He needs proper medical care. The company is worried. They have lawyers and—" Esperanza had learned to read the edges of civility. "He will go to the doctor," she said, keeping her voice level. The words were small, but her spine felt like it had been set with pins. "For now, he is our guest." Patricia's expression softened for only a beat, then resumed its careful neutrality. She explained, in measured terms, the complications of a public figure with a fragile body and a missing memory. There were shareholders and pensioners and complicated things that sounded like weather forecasts for storms that hit other people's houses. Esperanza listened. She liked to think she could understand the language, but the terms, succession, fiduciary duty, felt like the names of gods that had nothing to do with soup or mending. When Patricia left, after making notes and giving the impression of having done the moral tidy-up she was paid to provide, Esperanza felt the house close in on them. There are moments in which the world takes a breath and waits to see which side will exhale. She could hand the man over to the hotel, and that would be a respectable choice. She could call the police and wash her hands of the whole thing. Or she could do what she had been doing all her life, protect those in her care, and do the slow, quiet work of tenderness until something else demanded to be done. That evening, as the candles guttered in the plaza and the barrio hummed with distant songs, Alejandro sat at the small kitchen table and massaged his temples. Lupita set a plate of tamales before him as if she were offering the most valuable thing she owned. He looked at the food, at the simple devotion in her eyes, and something in him broke open with gratitude. He had been a man taught to order, to expect, to command. Here he learned to receive. The act carried with it a dignity he had not expected to find. Esperanza watched him from the shadow of the doorway, threading a new length of red thread through an old needle. She thought of how a single decision can tilt a life, to shelter or to surrender, to demand that the law come in its sterile uniform, or to let compassion be the temporary magistrate. She thought of how money could make problems smaller, and how it could also make them larger, like adding wind to an already raging fire. She thought, too, of the silk handkerchief she had returned to his pocket, and the initials that waited there like two small stars. The one who had stitched those letters had been someone who moved in rooms where others stood quiet. That man had fallen into her life the way a pebble falls into a pond, making ripples that now stretched toward the far edge of the city's glass towers. Somewhere beyond the barrio, a family would be waking to a report on the radio, to a breakfast filled with grief or confusion. Where would loyalty and obligation pull them? To reunion and care, or to contracts and power? Alejandro touched the monogram with a fingertip, as if testing whether it was real. "If I remember," he murmured, not to them but to himself. "I will have to choose." The sentence was hardly an answer, but the way it lay in the air made Esperanza's palms go clammy. Choice is a weight the poor learn to measure carefully. One wrong move can take away the roof, the bread, the small dignities that matter most.
She had known men who promised change from the heights and then retreated to their comfort. She had known women who accepted gilded offers and lost the quiet joy of a kitchen where children could feel safe. Love, she had learned, ought never to be bought, nor should safety be bartered for a promise that might dissolve. The days following the television report altered the rhythm of the house. Reporters called. A lawyer left a card. A man who said he represented Alejandro's family requested a meeting. Alejandro himself drifted between clarity and fog. Sometimes a scent or a sound would pull him back into a memory hot and precise, and other times his mind felt like a field with some of its crops burned away. In those hours, the barrio did what barrios do. It closed around them like a birth. Neighbors brought food and sat with hands folded, listening to the new questions as if they were prayers. Someone offered to keep watch in the street. A woman who mended umbrellas volunteered her small sewing machine should theirs break. There is a collective ethics to people who have little else to offer. They give what they have, and what they have is usually time, attention, a boiled chicken, a knot in a rope. It is not much by some measures, but it keeps a life moving. One afternoon, when the light softened in the windows like a benediction, Alejandro walked with Esperanza down a lane toward a vacant lot where children kicked a patched ball and elders sat in the thinner shade. He had developed the habit of moving slowly now, noticing edges and listening for a way to be helpful. His hand brushed a low fence and lingered. There underfoot were weeds and an old rusted sign. Esperanza's pockets still carried preoccupations about rent and repair, but she allowed herself to imagine the empty lot as a place where something could be built, a small community room perhaps, a place where children would not spill into empty walls when the rains came. He looked at the lot and then at her. "We could do something here," he said softly. "Not big, simple, for people who don't have a place." She studied him, seeing in his expression a bravery that wasn't for sale, and a humility that felt strange and perhaps hopeful. "You must be careful with words. Promises cost." "I know," he said. He had begun to measure his words the way someone learns the weight of silver spoons, careful in the hand. "But I would like to do it. For Lupita.
for Doña Carmen, for the people who looked out for me before I knew who I was. The idea was tender, dangerously so. It appealed to a part of Esperanza that believed in transformation, yet she also knew the grammar of real change, deeds, not declarations. A center needs a roof, funding, people to run it day in and day out. Money could make it happen, yes, but money alone cannot make a center that belongs to people. That belonged to those who would sit in it and argue and laugh and mend skirts and teach. People like them.
She allowed the thought to rest between them, a small seed tossed into uncertain soil. Then, as if to test a boundary, she said, "If you remember everything tomorrow and decide otherwise, will you still be coming back here tonight to eat with us?" He looked at the light spilling across the lot and then down to her hands stained with thread. "I've begun to like the way you say gracias, Diosito," he said with an awkward smile. "So yes, I will come back tonight." The present held them like a chair with 4 legs, precarious but real. They could sit and hold the balance for a while. But news is the tide that never rests. Even as they made these small covenants in the warm room of Esperanza's home, the broader world sharpened its edges. A photograph of Alejandro and a woman in a polished dress appeared in a gossip column. A headline speculated about a possible romance or a tenuous alibi. The photograph showed him with a woman whose eyes were made up for the spotlight and whose smile read like an announcement. A friend of the woman called Isabella Fernandez, and the image became a blade that could cut in private and public ways alike. The man who delivered papers to the plaza, his name Mateo, a boy of 20, came by one morning with a folded sheet. He handed it with the smile of someone who had picked up the habit of being an unwanted messenger. "They say there's a picture," he shrugged, as if the moment were neutral. "People talk." Alejandro's hands trembled when he opened the paper. The photograph was small and crisp, him in the hotel lobby, arm around a woman in a dress like moonlight. There was a trace of recognition when he saw her, but it was not personal warmth. It was instead the cold memory of an arrangement, of schedules and appearances. He folded the paper back over itself, as if to hide the truth. Esperanza watched him with a new, sharp worry. Not all secrets are harmless. Some exist to protect power. Others are buried because they would break a life apart. The stranger she had helped was hiding a life-changing secret, not only the fact of money or influence, but the questions about what he would do with that power and whom he would include in his choices. That night the house hummed as it had that first cold evening, but with new undertows. The neighborhood songs had a different timbre now, one that mixed pity and the curious thrill of having a story in one's street. Esperanza lay awake thinking of choices and of the cost of kindness. She thought of the needle she had used her whole life, the way a single stitch could hold a seam together or cause it to bunch if done wrong. She thought of the vacant lot and of a man in a suit who had learned to press masa with a child's hands. Outside, the city kept its own counsel. Lights blinked in distant towers, cars traced lines like fireflies, and somewhere a bell chimed a slow, patient note. In the small house they slept with an extra blanket draped over the guests' shoulders. Inside that small act lay the kind of answer that would not be decided by headlines or lawyers, but by the small, mundane miracles of trust. The story had begun, but like any story worth telling, it would move in increments, some sudden and bright, others slow as thread drawn through cloth. When dawn found them, a new element appeared on the horizon. A woman in a crisp uniform from a hospital arrived with a clipboard and a face that held the neutral compassion of someone who saw suffering often. She introduced herself as a nurse and asked whether Alejandro had any family nearby, whether he had any identification, whether there had been more injuries than the ones they had tended. She asked these things as if she were assembling a map. Esperanza answered as she always answered, with what she had. She offered the names she knew, Lupita's and Doña Carmen's, and the hint of a last name that they had given the stranger. The nurse made notes. She checked his pulse and the scar at his temple. "We will have to run some tests," she said. "Memory loss like this can come from many things. We will need to see a neurologist. The hospital—" She hesitated, the professional boundary folding in front of her like a curtain. "The hospital will call if they have questions." When the nurse left, closing the door with the soft click of promises deferred, Esperanza felt the first tug of what was to come, the legal world pulling at their small nets, the press of authority at the edges of their hearth. For now they had time, but time had a way of choosing whether it would be ally or enemy. She rose from her chair and crossed to the small cot where Alejandro slept. He held the silk handkerchief close in his palm, as if it were a talisman that could stitch back the missing pieces. Lupita stood by the window, watching birds hop among the wires, and Doña Carmen had returned to her rosary with a gaze that was both wary and resolute. Esperanza pressed the needle into the thread and drew it through the fabric of a dress she had promised to mend. The action steadied her. In small stitches lay the answers she adored: repair, patience, and the stubborn refusal to let a life unravel. The stranger she had helped was hiding a life-changing secret, yes, but secrets have the odd property of demanding choices. Which choices would be made, and at what cost? That question hung like laundry on a line in the wind, unable to be read from across the courtyard, yet impossible to ignore. Outside, the city breathed and prepared for the day. Inside, the house held its small human universe together. A child with a warm heart, an old woman with a prayer, a seamstress with calloused fingers, and a man whose name belonged to great rooms and glass windows. The next step would not be simple. It would require courage and examination, and somewhere out there, decisions were forming like winter buds, slow, tender, and likely to determine everything. The next weeks settled over the house like January itself, sharp, bright, and full of small reckonings. Appointments were made, medicines prescribed, and the rhythm of ordinary life bent itself around a new center of gravity. Alejandro's tests at the hospital were careful and slow, scans that checked for cuts and swelling, assessments by a neurologist who spoke in calm phrases about retraining the mind, and a social worker who asked with a practiced gentleness where his family might be found. Each visit returned him to their street with new information and a new kind of exhaustion. Memory did not come back in a single triumphant moment. It arrived in shards, snatches of a meeting, a name he could half place, the underside of a hand holding his own. When the hospital bill was settled quietly, no fanfare, no public announcement, Esperanza found a small envelope on the table with an address written in a careful hand. Inside was a check large enough to cover the immediate costs, and a note, "Thank you for everything." Alejandro had done it without show, arranging for discreet payments through a woman at the clinic who promised to take no questions. The act itself said more to Esperanza than any speech might have. He could use the language of money to make care possible, and he chose to do it without claiming credit. The neighborhood noticed small changes that did not look like the gestures of a man trying to buy affection. A local clinic received a donation that allowed one extra nurse on weekend shifts. A roof was repaired on a neighbor's house without the donor's name posted on a stone.
Alejandro came with patience rather than dollars in the beginning, sitting on a low chair while a seamstress explained how her old machine stuck, learning the precise motion to thread a needle and the small, fierce pride that came with mending something that mattered. He did not announce a campaign. He listened. That listening would be the thing people remembered longer than any headline. But the city has its own appetite. The photograph in a paper and the gossip clip on a morning show had not cooled. Patricia returned more often, her visits measured but relentless. She arrived with a man named Ricardo once, tall and efficient, a figure shaped by boardrooms and spreadsheets, his suit a neutral armor. He introduced himself politely, then leaned into the business of their lives. He asked direct questions about when Alejandro would be well enough to return to his responsibilities, about the legalities of his absence, and about how quickly the narrative might be managed to avoid shareholder panic. Esperanza listened to Ricardo with an even face. She had learned to understand two kinds of speech, the language of need and the language of power. Ricardo's words belonged to the second. He spoke of fiduciary duty and succession plans, of family statements and press releases that needed to be timed like a careful tide. "We want him to recover fully," he said.
"But there are decisions that cannot wait. The company has responsibilities." Patricia, who had softened once in the presence of a child's scraped knee, now shared a look with Ricardo that smelled of decision. "We must be careful," she murmured, as she stood in their cramped kitchen. "There are people who will try to take advantage of the uncertainty. It's our job to protect the estate and the employees and—" her hand bracketed the word in a way that meant both families and funds. Esperanza's answer was practical and honest. "He will do what he must," she said, "but he is here now, and he has a right to know who he is. When he is ready, we will take the proper steps." Ricardo's eyebrows knit, as if he were measuring the elasticity of her answer. "The press," he began, but Doña Carmen cut across him with an economy of words that belonged to someone who had sharpened a life into useful advice. "You will not frighten us from doing what is right," she said. "Money cannot be allowed to make us forget that this man sat in our kitchen and learned to make tamales." Ricardo blinked at the old woman's bluntness, then smiled. "Of course," he said, "our priority is his well-being." Behind the polite phrases, pressure built. An open letter circulated among shareholders, urging swift leadership, while a rival hotel chain sniffed opportunity at the margins. Lawyers wrote careful notes. Someone sent a private investigator to their street, and people who had once minded their own business started to notice more, to look at the house with a curiosity that felt invasive. It was a delicate thing, the way ordinary life began to be pulled out towards the glare of big questions. Within that friction, Alejandro learned who he was by what he could not bear to do again. One afternoon, when a memory came like a gust, sharp as citrus, unmistakable, a single image of men in a conference room laying out plans for demolition of a cluster of homes to make way for a new hotel wing pricked him so painfully he doubled over. He could see an architect's rendering, bright and cold. He could hear someone call it efficient development. The sound of his own signature on a page surfaced with it, and it felt like a hand he'd given away. That night he slept poorly. In waking hours he found himself staring at Doña Carmen as she rolled masa and thinking of the families who might have lost their houses to decisions made behind glass. The memory stitched itself into his conscience with humiliating speed. The man who had once signed away neighborhoods had been a stranger now to the man who learned to fold tamales into banana leaves. When he told Esperanza, his voice small and raw, she did not flinch. "People sign things in rooms where numbers matter more than faces," she said slowly. "But now that you remember, the decision is yours to make."
His choice came not as an act of theater, but as a series of practical moves.
He called a meeting at the hotel, short, private, and when the board convened, he spoke with a steadier cadence than many expected. He did not resign or make grand announcements. He proposed concrete changes, a fund for workers' housing repairs, a program to guarantee predictable shifts, and a basic health care package for the cleaning staff and bellhops, a commitment to engage neighborhood representatives before any expansion plans that might displace families. He asked for a vote to set aside a parcel for community development within 5 years as part of their corporate social responsibility. When some members scoffed, "We cannot be expected to surrender margins for sentiment," he replied with a simplicity that surprised them. "Those margins are built on people," he said. "If we ask others to give everything, we must accept that the company owes something back." The vote was not unanimous. Boards rarely are. There were arguments about optics and legal constraints. There were thinly veiled threats about taking power into other hands if the company seemed unable to steer itself. But Alejandro had the authority the world had given him before he lost it, and he used it in ways that were not just symbolic. Contracts were re-examined. Partnerships with suppliers were reviewed. A transparent auditing process was put in place so workers could voice concerns without intermediaries who might profit from secrecy. He insisted on a phased plan and on oversight that included representatives from barrios like Esperanza's. For Esperanza, the change mattered less because it was from him and more because it was steady. He did not announce the decisions at the plaza with cameras at his back. He asked Doña Carmen's advice before signing the official letter that designated the lot for the community space. He brought the papers to the house and sat at the kitchen table while Lupita traced the signatures with a pencil like a game. "This is not about me proving I can be good," Alejandro said, hesitant. "It's about not doing the things I used to do without seeing their cost." She smiled at him then, a small, guarded thing that did not melt under declarations. "We will see," she said. "This life will show itself in time." Not everyone welcomed the changes. Isabella Fernandez, whose face had lived like a shadow in the photograph, appeared in the narrative again. She came to the hotel with hair and shoes and an air of someone who had never known want. Her appearance on a morning program and in society pages had made her a figure people loved to hate or loved to imitate. She was part of Alejandro's previous life, a woman accustomed to the public stage, her life a rotation of red carpets and carefully curated smiles. At a charity gala, shortly after Alejandro resumed some public duties, Isabella approached him under a chandelier that made everything look softer than it was. "I hear you're changing things," she said with a measured smile. Her voice carried the polished cadence of PR in survival. "That can be dangerous for your reputation." "Some risks are worth it," he answered quietly. He wore no cufflinks that night, only a plain jacket. The absence was noticed more by those who tracked ornaments than ideas. Isabella's expression tightened with the kind of calculation that makes people move like chess pieces. "You must understand," she said. "There are expectations. The world likes its heroes tidy and full of all the certainty we imagine. If you stand against the tide, you risk being seen as erratic." Alejandro looked at her, and for a second the man he had been rose like a damp shadow. "And if I stand with the people who clean those rooms," he asked quietly, "who feed the guests and carry the bags and who come to my country club doors in the rain, I risk being what? For you, quite possibly just confused?" Her smile went cool. "Think of consequences," she said. "Think of shareholders. Think of stability." He thought of Doña Carmen's hands forming perfect masa balls, and of Lupita's laugh. He thought of the vacant lot and of the way a roof could change the geometry of daily life for a neighborhood. "I am thinking of choices," he said, "and I'm choosing." The tension between his public obligations and his private conscience flared in small, sharp ways. A young reporter attempted to pry into his time at Esperanza's house, asking whether his time in the barrio had been an affectation. A corporate rival tried to leverage a rumor of ill health, but each attempt met a new structure, a needle-thin policy for accountability, a new fund managed with transparency, regular community meetings where workers had a voice. It was less headline and more plumbing, small but necessary work that fixed leaks rather than performed a spectacle. At home, romance moved like a candle underneath a bell jar, steady, private, careful. There were moments. A hand offered to steady a daughter on an uneven step, Alejandro learning to sew a button under Esperanza's tutelage with concentration and a clumsy tenderness. A night he sat up late listening to Lupita as she rehearsed a song for school, his face lit by a lamp, eyes soft with a dawning affection he did not rush to define. Esperanza refused easy declarations. She kept the boundaries that protected her family. She accepted help where it was real and sustained. When Alejandro offered to arrange a loan so she could buy a newer machine for her sewing work, she demurred until he insisted politely and with humility, making clear that the machine would be in her name and that he expected no repayment other than to see it used well. "Why help me?" she asked him once, sitting on a stoop as twilight smeared the sky. "Because I do not want my money to be only a way to silence my guilt. If I must live with what I've done, let it be in service. If I can make something that makes life easier, then at least one choice I make will be for good."
She nodded slowly. "Then you must stay the course," she said. "Promises are gifts. Keep them by turning them into work." Months folded over like new hems. The lot they had chosen, an uneven, sunburnt patch where boys chased a tattered ball, began to change. There were meetings to decide the building's shape, but those meetings were held in the plaza and in the house of a neighbor whose son knew carpentry. They decided on a single-story building with broad windows and a durable roof, a kitchen that could do hot meals, and a room with tables for after-school programs and sewing circles. The architects drafted plans that were simple and practical, and the budget was managed by a committee that included Esperanza and 2 other neighborhood representatives. When Alejandro insisted on a public tender for the contracting work, some eyebrows rose, but he did not back down. He wanted the money to lift the neighborhood, not to be recycled to those already rich. The center's progress was visible in small human moments. A delivery of new school books stacked at the corner, a worker teaching a class on electrical safety, a group of women lining up with their patched uniforms to learn basic bookkeeping and tailoring. For Alejandro, the days of boardroom solitude were punctuated by afternoons of teaching basic maintenance to men used to carrying suitcases rather than ladders. He scraped paint and swept floors when needed, hands learning a new callus pattern as he worked alongside neighbors. Doña Carmen's health, which had wavered through the winter, improved with discreet medical follow-up and the kind of consistent attention that money can buy, but which also requires managerial will. A doctor came at Alejandro's request and arranged for a small regimen that helped stabilize her blood pressure and gave her energy back. The arrangement was handled quietly, without cameras and without credits in a charitable ledger. The family wanted help, not exposure. Patricia, whose efficiency had initially suggested a chain of command rather than a person, softened toward the household as she saw the changes take root. She began to bring news that mattered less for its public relations value and more for its practicality. A grant opportunity from a civic foundation, a vocational trainer who might run workshops, the contact of a lawyer who helped draft transparent policies for the center. her loyalty shifted in ways that felt surprising to her colleagues and quietly satisfying to Esperanza. She too found that closeness to the barrio changed her language. When she came now, she brought a thermos of coffee and stayed to help fold tamales. Not everything moved smoothly. A scandal tried to lurch into being when an old business associate of Alejandro's leaked a conversation implying an older pattern of ruthless decisions. The paper that carried the story did not know the neighborhood like Esperanza did, and so it painted everything in broad strokes.
For a moment, it looked as though the community might fracture. Some feared that the money might be contingent upon his public performance, and that if the image cracked, so too would support. But the neighbors, those who had seen Alejandro brighten a child's scraped knee or carry a bag of groceries up 3 flights for Doña Carmen, chose differently. They had watched months of presence. Their trust had been earned. A little group formed that week and went to the press offices to ask for privacy and to explain in measured tones what the center meant to them. Their words did not drown out all the noise, but they slowed the machinery of gossip enough for things to continue. The slow work of memory also continued. Alejandro had good days and bad ones. A smell, polish, and lemon might bring intact the recollection of a meeting with a tyrant uncle. A melody, some hollow instrumental played at the hotel, might return a montage of nights in rooms he'd mistaken for home. Some memories were kind, like an image of a small child's hand clasping his during a parade. Others were humiliating, like the memory of discounting a house owner's plea to avoid the small cost of relocation. Each recollection forced a new answer, apology, action, restitution where possible. He never demanded absolution. He worked as if penance were less about suffering and more about repair. One night, as the center's foundation was being laid and the sound of hammering had become a steady lullaby across the street, Alejandro found himself in the plaza with Lupita. She had grown taller in the months he had known her, her braids longer, her voice more confident. They were looking up at strings of lights that made the square look like an overturned jar of stars. "Do you remember the first night?" she asked, turning to him. He did. The image came like a film flash, his unsteady breath under a shawl, the tender hands of Esperanza tending a cut, Lupita's small, urgent kindness. It felt holy because it had nothing to do with ceremony. It was simply human. "I remember," he said. "I remember being lost." She looked at him, a child's logic making fewer distinctions. "You were not lost the whole time," she said, as if reading a truth she had made up. "You were finding where you belong." The words sank into him. That belonging was not merely a place to sleep or a handful of friendly faces. It was accountability, an invitation to remain in the daily work of repair, rather than to flee to anonymity among towers of glass. He had been given an unexpected second chance. He refused to let it be squandered on appearances. The completion of the center took time, permits, delays, a storm that washed out a foundation day. But each obstacle was met with neighbors working with contractors, apprentices learning trades, and children painting a mural that would sit on one of the exterior walls. When the day came to hang the small plaque, 3 names scrawled with neat handprints around them, Esperanza, Lupita, and the neighborhood, the air smelled of wet paint and tamales and the slow exhilaration of achievement. Alejandro had insisted that the center be named not after him or his family, but for the community itself, Casa Esperanza, a tribute to a woman whose life had been ordinary and generous. There was a small private moment before the inauguration. Alejandro found Esperanza at the work table, where she had mended the last of a batch of coats for cold weather donations. The table was cluttered with thread and buttons like the innards of someone's careful life. He held out a small package wrapped in a scrap of cloth. When she opened it,
Inside was a slender pendant shaped like a tiny sewing needle with a single small emerald set into the handle. It was delicate, the kind of object that felt like it carried a story. "I found it in my father's things," he said softly. "My mother used to keep steel needles in a wooden box. I thought, if you'll let me, I'd like you to have it." Esperanza's fingers closed around the pendant as if she had taken in a physical prayer. "Why give me this?" she asked, without looking up. "Because you taught me that small things hold people together," he said. "Because you showed me how to keep a life from unraveling." She allowed a private smile to touch her face. Then, in the way she always did, she made him earn the gift. "We will wear this when the center opens. We will wear it when things get hard, so we remember what keeps us." He accepted her condition without argument. The pendant hung against her chest that night under the shawl. It was a small thing, and yet it read like a covenant. The center opened on a cool spring morning. There were speeches, some brief and heartfelt, some long and verbose, and music that came from a neighbor who knew how to coax harmonies out of an old guitar. The first class filled quickly. Children sat at small tables with new pencils, and a seamstress taught a sewing course to women who had never had a formal space to craft in. A wall displayed a list of workers' rights, posted for anyone to read in clear handwriting, and a small office had a board where complaints could be filed and addressed. Alejandro spoke for a few minutes, his words measured, thanking those who had worked and those who had taught him to listen. He did not stand long on a platform. Instead, he moved through crowds, carrying a tray of tamales he had helped fold with Lupita the day before, handing them out with a shy humility that looked oddly like gratitude. Time, that slow meter of human decisions, continued to pass. The company's quarterly reports reflected a cost center that had been added, community investment. Some financial analysts grumbled, but turnover improved in the hotel's staff.
There were fewer sick days. There was less attrition. The laundry staff complained less of back-breaking hours because shifts had been rebalanced with new hiring practices. The company did not become a paragon overnight, nor did its critics vanish, but a pattern had shifted. 1 year after the night he had first been found by the fountain, the barrio celebrated quietly in the plaza. The posada came round the block as it did each holiday, but this year the sounds carried an extra richness. The center was active, its lights pooling on the cobblestones, and Doña Carmen moved with a steadier step, smiling with a small triumph that only those who had known winter deeply could understand. Lupita had a new dress sewn on the machine Alejandro had helped buy, and she sang with a voice that held a child's earnestness and a community's pride. Alejandro stood by Esperanza as the candles trembled and the songs rose. He had not been restored to a pristine past. His memory remained partial, with gaps that would probably never be filled perfectly. What filled him instead was the continuity of choice. He had made decisions, sometimes clumsy and often humble, to weave his resources into the lives that had taught him warmth. At the edge of the plaza, a small crowd gathered as the center's doors opened for an anniversary fair. There was laughter and an old woman selling rosaries that glinted like small promises. Someone from a regional newspaper, no longer hunting scandal, had written a piece about neighborhoods reclaiming their agency. A camera caught Esperanza pressing a needle into a hem with the same surety she had always had. The frame froze for a moment that seemed to contain everything: thread, hand, and repair. Later, as the night folded into a gentle hush, Alejandro and Esperanza walked slowly down a lane toward the fountain where the first scene had unfolded. The city lights threw faint reflections across the water. It was a full circle that did not feel like an ending so much as a breath drawn deep. "You kept a stranger," he said, quietly, remembering the first time she had wrapped her shawl around his shoulders. "You could have turned him in or shrugged and said the world would handle it." She looked at him and saw the man he had been and the man she had watched become. "You kept a person," she corrected gently. "Being human is not a debt to be paid, it's a responsibility given." He smiled, small and private. "What cost me most was thinking I had the right to decide things from rooms I did not understand. You have learned. That is all any of us can do." He took her hand in the lamplight, an action unadorned and steady. He did not kneel, he did not make a speech. He merely stood by the woman who had taught him to value daily work, who had kept her household together with thread and grace. Lupita skipped ahead, humming, and Doña Carmen walked behind, rosary in hand, and a face that held the night like a shield.
In the plaza, a teen set off a small cluster of fireworks that scattered like bright seeds into the sky. People cheered, and the sound seemed to stitch the neighborhood to itself. For Alejandro, for Esperanza, for Lupita, the moment was not about fortune or headlines. It was about a life reassembled from choices and the steady labor of a community that had not allowed itself to be sold out by spectacle. When they returned to the house, Alejandro took out a small box he had kept for months. Inside lay a scrap of fabric and the silk handkerchief with the embroidered initials that had once been a fragment of someone else's life. He handed it to Esperanza without story, only with the quiet trust that she would know what to do with it. She fingered the letters, then pushed the handkerchief back across the table. "Keep it," she said. "It will remind you that you were not always whole. Remembering what you were is sometimes the compass that keeps you honest." He nodded, and in his eyes there was the steady calm of someone who had been given and had chosen a new north. The stranger she helped had indeed been hiding a life-changing secret, but what that secret had done, what it allowed them to face, was the beginning of something that belonged not to him alone, but to every hand that had picked up a hammer or threaded a needle in the months since. Outside, the city breathed, and the small house warmed with the smell of stew and the quiet of people who have found, in the marrow of one another, a way to live. The red and green lights strung in the plaza dimmed toward dawn, and the first rooster crowed as if marking a map. The center hummed in the distance, a promise of rooms lit and hands joined. The life-changing secret had not been a prize to be claimed. It had been a truth that demanded responses, work, and responsibility. In that response, they discovered something more durable than the shine of any photograph, a shared life built on choices, not on the whims of a camera. If this story touched you, and you want more of these evening in a plaza moments, subscribe for other true feeling stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. There are many plazas in the world, and each one holds its own quiet revolution.